Welcome to Sherwood United Methodist Church. My name is Eric Clark. I'm pastor here, and today we're going to be doing a presentation for you. This is a dramatic reading of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospels, like most of the New Testament, were composed at a time when the vast majority of the population was not literate, and the communities that would have received these Gospels would have received them orally. They would have been read aloud in public settings, in a meeting at night over dinner or something, and they would have been read with a lot of energy and characterization over and over as a kind of like familiar story to be repeated in the community. And so they would have been experienced, from beginning to end to completion in the whole story told at once, and they would have been experienced in a sort of like live storytelling way, which is very different from how we usually read the Gospels now. Nowadays, we read them either by ourselves, sitting and reading them out of a text, or when we're in church, we read them divided up into little chunks. The fancy word for that is a pericope, which is just a little section of text that we often attribute to specific days of the year. We have a calendar called a lectionary, which specifies when certain texts are to be read, but we read those texts out of context. We read just the little piece and not the whole story, and so we often miss the whole narrative. We often miss the way it flows together, it fits together, and we miss how it is coherent and interesting. So today we're going to try to bring it alive for you by reading it in a more dramatic way and reading it as a complete piece. The whole text will probably take us about 90 minutes. There is going to be an intermission, a little more than halfway through. So we will give you a break in the middle to stretch and go use the restroom or whatever if you need. And you're, of course, free at any point to attend to your needs during that time. Don't feel trapped in here with us, but you're welcome to move around and such as you need to do so. I'm really grateful to some friends who've volunteered to be up here with me today to do this reading with us. So I'm going to introduce them and ask them just to say, something about your performance experience or something while you're here. So at the end down here, we have Kalila Abazeder.
Hi, I've just been doing plays and musicals for the last year, really.
And she's awesome at it. She's great at it. All right, and here is Janessa Rose.
Hi, I am going to be a senior in high school, and I've been doing shows since my freshman year.
And this is Amanda Eichstedt.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I've been working with these folks over here for the last couple of years in Portland, but have done theater for my undergrad work and all over the country, kind of, I guess, for a while.
All right, and this is Jesse Alwyn.
Hello, I've been doing performing arts since I was a wee boy. I started singing in church and just have gotten into theater and everything after that, so I love it. I will continue to do it.
And Rachel Alwyn.
I have been doing theater for about as long as I can remember. I moved to Portland 7 years ago to do theater out here in the Pacific Northwest, and will continue to do so. 8 years.
We're really glad to be here with you this morning. Some people may filter in as they come in, and we'll just take it as it comes. And now we invite you to sit back and enjoy a dramatic reading of the Gospel of Mark. The beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ.
God's Son.
It happened just as it was written about in the prophecy of Isaiah.
Look, I am sending my messenger before you. He will prepare your way, a voice shouting in the wilderness. Prepare the way for the Lord. Make his path straight.
John the Baptist was in the wilderness, calling for people to be baptized, to show that they were changing their hearts and lives and wanted God to forgive their sins.
Everyone in Judea and all the people of Jerusalem went out to the Jordan River and were being baptized by John as they confessed their sins.
John wore clothes made of camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. He ate locusts and wild honey.
He announced,
One stronger than I am is coming after me. I'm not even worthy to bend over and loosen the strap of his sandals. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit.
About that time, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and John baptized him in the Jordan River. While he was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw heaven splitting open and the Spirit like a dove coming down on him. And there was a voice from heaven.
You are my Son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness.
At once, the Spirit forced Jesus out into the wilderness.
He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan.
He was among the wild animals, and the angels took care of him.
After John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, announcing God's good news, saying,
Now is the time. Here comes God's kingdom. Change your hearts and lives and trust this good news.
As Jesus passed along the Galilee Sea, he saw two brothers, Simon and Andrew, throwing fishing nets into the sea, for they were fishermen.
Come, follow me,
He said,
and I'll show you how to fish for people.
Right away, they left their nets and followed him.
After going a little farther, he saw James and John, Zebedee's sons, in their boat repairing the fishing nets. At that very moment, he called them.
They followed him, leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired workers. Jesus and his followers went to Capernaum immediately on the Sabbath. Jesus entered the synagogue and started teaching.
The people were amazed by his teaching, for he was teaching them with authority, not like legal experts. Suddenly, there in the synagogue, a person with an evil spirit screamed, "Ah!"
What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One from God.
Silence!
Jesus said, speaking harshly to the demon.
Come out of him!
The unclean spirit shook him and screamed. Then it came out.
Everyone was shaken and questioned among themselves.
What's this? A new teaching with authority? He even commands unclean spirits, and they obey him.
Right away, the news about him spread throughout the entire region of Galilee.
After leaving the synagogue, Jesus, James, and John went home with Simon and Andrew.
Simon's mother-in-law was in bed, sick with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once.
He went to her, took her by the hand, and raised her up. The fever left her, and she served them. That evening at sunset, people brought to Jesus those who were sick or demon-possessed. The whole town gathered near the door. He healed many who were sick with all kinds of diseases, and he threw out many demons.
But he didn't let the demons speak, because they recognized him.
Early in the morning, well before sunrise, Jesus rose and went to a deserted place where he could be alone in prayer. Simon and those with him tracked him down. When they found him, they told him,
Everyone's looking for you.
He replied,
Let's head in the other direction to the nearby villages so that I can preach there too. That's why I've come.
He traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and throwing out demons.
A man with a skin disease approached Jesus, fell to his knees, and begged.
If you want, you can make me clean.
Incensed, Jesus reached out his hand, touched him, and said,
I do want to. Be clean.
Instantly, the skin disease left him, and he was clean.
Sternly, Jesus sent him away, saying,
Don't say anything to anyone. Instead, go and show yourself to the priests and offer the sacrifice of your cleansing that Moses commanded. This will be a testimony to them.
Instead, he went out and started talking freely and spreading the news so that Jesus wasn't able to enter a town openly. He remained outside in deserted places, but people came to him from everywhere.
Jesus returned to the synagogue. A man with a withered hand was there, wanting to bring charges against Jesus. They were watching Jesus closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. He said to the man with the withered hand,
Step up where people can see you.
Then he said to him,
Is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?
But they said nothing.
Looking around at them with anger, deeply grieved at their unyielding hearts, he said to the man,
Stretch out your hand.
So he did, and his hand was made healthy. At that, the Pharisees got together with the supporters of Herod to plan how to destroy Jesus.
Jesus left with his disciples and went to the lake. A large crowd followed him because they had heard what he was doing. They were from Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and beyond the Jordan and the area surrounding Tyre and Sidon.
Jesus told his disciples to get a small boat ready for him so the crowd wouldn't crush him. He had healed so many people that everyone who was sick pushed forward so that they could touch him.
Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down at his feet and shouted,
You are God's Son!
but he strictly ordered them not to reveal who he was.
Jesus went up on a mountain and called those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 and called them apostles. He appointed them to be with him, to be sent out to preach.
And to have authority to throw out demons.
He appointed 12, Peter, a name he gave Simon, James and John, Zebedee's sons, whom he nicknamed Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, and Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, Alphaeus' son, Thaddeus, Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot.
Who betrayed Jesus?
Jesus entered a house. A crowd gathered again so that it was impossible for him and his followers even to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they came to take control of him. They were saying,
He's out of his mind.
The legal experts came down from Jerusalem. Over and over they charged,
He's possessed by Beelzebub. He throws out demons with the authority of the ruler of all demons.
When Jesus called them together, he spoke to them in a parable.
How can Satan throw Satan out? A kingdom involved in civil war will collapse, and a house torn apart by divisions will collapse. If Satan rebels against himself and is divided, then he can't endure. He's done for. No one gets into the house of a strong person and steals anything without first tying up the strong person. Only then can the house be burglarized. I assure you that human beings will be forgiven for everything, for all sins and insults of every kind. But whoever insults the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. That person is guilty of a sin with consequences that last forever.
He said this because the legal experts were saying,
He's possessed by an evil spirit.
His mother and brothers arrived. They stood outside and sent word to him, calling for him. A crowd was seated around him, and those sent to him said,
Look, your mother, brother, sister, and sisters are outside looking for you.
He replied,
Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?
Looking around at those seated around him in a circle, he said,
Look, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother, sister, and mother.
Jesus began to teach beside the lake again.
Such a large crowd gathered that he climbed into a boat there on the lake. He sat in a boat while the whole crowd was nearby on the shore.
He said many things to them in parables.
While teaching them, he said,
Listen to this. A farmer went out to scatter seed. As he was scattering seed, some fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where the soil was shallow. They sprouted immediately because the soil wasn't deep. When the sun came up, it scorched the plants, and they dried up because they had no roots. Other seed fell among thorny plants. The thorny plants grew and choked the seeds, and they produced nothing. Other seed fell into good soil and bore fruit. Upon growing and increasing, the seed produced in one case a yield of 30 to 1, in another case a yield of 60 to 1, and in another case a yield of 100 to 1.
He said,
Whoever has ears to listen should pay attention.
When they were alone, the people around Jesus, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. He said to them,
The secret of God's kingdom has been given to you, but to those who are outside, everything comes in parables. This is so that they can look and see, but have no insight, and they can hear, but not understand. Otherwise, they might turn their lives around and be forgiven.
Jesus said,
Don't you understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? The farmer scatters the word. This is the meaning of the seed that fell on the path. When the word is scattered and people hear it, right away, Satan comes and steals that word that was planted in them. Here's the meaning of the seed that fell on the rocky ground. When people hear the word, they immediately receive it joyfully. But because they have no roots, they last for only a little while. When they experience distress or abuse because of the word, they immediately fall away. Others are like the seeds scattered amongst the thorny plants. These are the ones who have heard the word, but the worries of this life, the false appeal of wealth, and the desire for more things break in and choke the word, and it bears no fruit. The seeds scattered on good soil are those who hear the word and embrace it. They bear fruit. In one case, a yield of 30 to 1, in another case, a yield of 60 to 1, and in another case, 100 to 1.
Jesus said to them,
Does anyone bring in a lamp in order to put it under a basket or a bed? Shouldn't it be placed by a lampstand? Everything hidden will be revealed, and everything secret will come out into the open. Whoever has ears to listen should pay attention.
he said to them,
Listen carefully. God will evaluate you with the same standard you use to evaluate others. Indeed, you will receive even more. Those who have will receive more, but as for those who don't have, even what they don't have will be taken away from them.
And then Jesus said,
This is what God's kingdom is like. It's as though someone scatters seed on the ground, then sleeps and wakes night and day. The seed sprouts and grows, but the farmer doesn't know how. The earth produces crops all by itself. First the stalk, then the head, then the full head of grain. Whenever the crop is ready, the farmer goes out to cut the grain because it's harvest time.
He continued.
What's a good image for God's kingdom? What parable can I use to explain it? Consider a mustard seed. When scattered on the ground, it's the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But when it's planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all vegetable plants. It produces such large branches that the birds in the sky are able to nest in its shade.
With many such parables, he continued to give them the word, as much as they were able to hear.
He spoke to them only in parables, then explained everything to his disciples when he was alone with them.
Later that day, when evening came, Jesus said to them,
Let's cross over to the other side of the lake.
They left the crowd and took him in the boat just as he was. Other boats followed along.
Gale force winds arose, and waves crashed against the boat, so that the boat was swamped, but Jesus was in the rear of the boat, sleeping on a pillow. They woke him up and said,
Teacher, don't you care that we're drowning?
He got up and gave orders to the wind. He said to the lake,
Silence, be still.
The wind settled down, and there was a great calm. Jesus asked them,
Why are you frightened? Don't you have faith yet?
Overcome with awe, they said to each other,
Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him.
Jesus and his disciples came to the other side of the lake, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as Jesus got out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out of the tombs.
This man lived among the tombs, and no one was ever strong enough to restrain him, even with a chain. He had been secured many times with leg irons and chains, but he broke the chains and smashed the leg irons. No one was tough enough to control him.
Night and day in the tombs and the hills, he would howl and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from far away, he ran and knelt before him, shouting,
What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you won't torture me.
He said this because Jesus had already commanded him.
Unclean spirit, come out of this man.
Jesus asked him,
What is your name?
and he responded,
Legion is my name, because we are many.
They pleaded with Jesus not to send them out of that region.
A large herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside.
Send us into the pigs.
They begged.
Let us go into the pigs.
Jesus gave them permission, so the unclean spirits left the man and went into the pigs. Then the herd of about 2,000 pigs rushed down the cliff into the lake and drowned.
Those who tended the pigs ran away and told the story in the city and in the countryside. People came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the man who used to be demon-possessed. They saw the very man who had been filled with many demons sitting there fully dressed and completely sane, and they were filled with awe.
Those who had actually seen what happened to the demon-possessed man told the others about the pigs. Then they pleaded with Jesus to leave their region.
While he was climbing into the boat, the one who had been demon-possessed pleaded with Jesus to let him come along as one of his disciples. But Jesus wouldn't allow it.
Go home to your own people
Jesus said,
and tell them what the Lord has done for you and how he has shown you mercy.
The man went away and began to proclaim in the 10 cities all that Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
Jesus crossed the lake again, and on the other side a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, came forward. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him.
My daughter is about to die. Please come and place your hands on her so that she can be healed and live.
So Jesus went with him.
A swarm of people were following Jesus, crowding in on him. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a lot under the care of many doctors and had spent everything she had without getting any better. In fact, she had gotten worse.
Because she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes.
She was thinking, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Her bleeding stopped immediately, and she sensed in her body that her illness had been healed.
At that very moment, Jesus recognized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said,
Who touched my clothes?
His disciples said to him,
Don't you see the crowd pressing against you, yet you asked, Who touched me?
But Jesus looked around carefully to see who had done it. The woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward. Knowing that what had happened to her, she fell down in front of Jesus and told him the whole truth. He responded,
Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed from your disease.
While Jesus was still speaking with her, messengers came from the synagogue leader's house, saying to Jairus,
Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any longer?
But Jesus overheard their report and said to the synagogue leader,
Don't be afraid. Just keep trusting.
He didn't allow anyone to follow him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. They came to the synagogue leader's house, and he saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them,
What's all this commotion and crying about? The child isn't dead, she's only sleeping.
They laughed at him, but he threw them all out.
Then, taking the child's parents and his disciples with him, he went to the room where the child was. Taking her hand, he said to her,
Talita kum.
which means,
Young woman, get up.
Suddenly, the young woman got up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were shocked.
Oh, it's not highlighted. He gave them strict orders that no one should know what had happened. Then he told them to give her something to eat.
Jesus left that place and came to his hometown. His disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. Many who heard him were surprised.
Where did this man get all this? What's this wisdom he has been giving? What about the powerful acts accomplished through him? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't he Mary's son and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?
They were repulsed by him and fell into sin.
Jesus said to them,
Prophets are honored everywhere except in their hometowns, among their relatives, and in their own households.
He was unable to do any miracles there, except that he placed his hands on a few sick people and healed them. He was appalled by their disbelief.
Then Jesus traveled through the surrounding villages teaching. He called for the 12 and sent them out in pairs.
He gave them authority over unclean spirits.
He instructed them to take nothing for the journey except a walking stick, no bread, no bags, and no money in their belts. He told them to wear sandals, but not to put on 2 shirts. He said,
Whatever house you enter, remain there until you leave that place. If a place doesn't welcome or listen to you, as you leave, shake the dust off your feet as a witness against them.
So they went out and proclaimed that people should change their hearts and lives.
They cast out many demons, and they anointed many sick people with olive oil and healed them.
Herod, the king, heard about these things, because the name of Jesus had become well known. Some were saying,
John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and this is why miraculous powers are at work through him.
Others were saying,
He is Elijah.
Still others were saying.
He is a prophet, like one of the ancient prophets.
But when Herod heard these rumors, he said,
John, whom I beheaded, has been raised to life.
He said this because Herod himself had arranged to have John arrested and put in prison because Herodias, the wife of Herod's brother Philip, Herod had married her, but John told Herod,
It's against the law for you to marry your brother's wife.
So Herodias had it in for John. She wanted to kill him, but she couldn't.
This was because Herod respected John. He regarded him as a righteous and holy person, so he protected him. John's words greatly confused Herod, yet he enjoyed listening to him.
Finally, the time was right.
It was on one of Herod's birthdays when he had prepared a feast for his high-ranking officials and military officers and Galilee's leading residents. Herod's daughter Herodias came in and danced, thrilling Herod and his dinner guests.
The king said to the young woman,
Ask me whatever you wish, and I will give it to you.
Then he swore to her.
Whatever you ask, I will give to you, even as much as half of my kingdom.
She left the banquet hall and said to her mother,
What should I ask for?
John the Baptist's head.
Herodias replied. Hurrying back to the ruler, she made her request.
I want you to give me John the Baptist's head on a plate, right this minute.
Although the king was upset because of his solemn pledge and his guests, he didn't want to refuse her. So he ordered a guard to bring John's head. The guard went to the prison, cut off John's head, brought his head on a plate, and gave it to the young woman, and she gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard what happened, they came and took his dead body and laid it in a tomb.
The apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. Many people were coming and going, so there was no time to eat. He said to the apostles,
Come by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while.
They departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. Many people saw them leaving and recognized them, so they ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them.
When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them. because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things.
Late in the day, his disciples came to him and said,
This is an isolated place, and it's already late in the day. Send them away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something to eat for themselves.
He replied.
You give them something to eat.
But they said to him,
Should we go off and buy bread worth almost 8 months' pay and give it to them to eat?
He said to them.
How much bread do you have? Take a look.
After checking, they said,
5 loaves of bread and 2 fish.
He directed the disciples to seat all the people in groups as though they were having a banquet on the green grass.
They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties.
He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, broke the loaves into pieces, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate until they were full.
They filled 12 baskets with the leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 had eaten.
Right then, Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go to the other side of the lake toward Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd.
After saying goodbye to them, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray.
Evening came, and a boat was in the middle of the lake, but he was alone on the land. He saw his disciples struggling. They were trying to row forward, but the wind was blowing against them. Very early in the morning he came to them, walking on the lake.
He intended to pass by them.
When they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they screamed. Seeing him was terrifying to all of them.
Just then he spoke to them.
Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid.
He got into the boat, and the wind settled down. His disciples were so baffled that they were beside themselves.
That's because they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their minds had been closed so that they resisted God's ways.
When Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored the boat and came ashore.
People immediately recognized Jesus and ran around that whole region, bringing sick people and their mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, villages, cities, or farming communities, they would place the sick in the marketplaces and beg him to allow them to touch even the hem of his clothing.
Everyone who touched him was healed.
The Pharisees and some legal experts from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. They saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands.
They were eating without first ritually purifying their hands through washing. The Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat without first washing their hands carefully. This is a way of observing the rules handed down by the elders. Upon returning from the marketplace, they don't eat without first immersing themselves. They observe many other rules that have been handed down, such as the washing of cups, jugs, pans, and sleeping mats.
So the Pharisees and legal experts asked Jesus,
Why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands?
He replied,
Isaiah really knew what he was talking about when he prophesied about you hypocrites. He wrote,
This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Their worship of me is empty, since they teach instructions that are human words.
You ignore God's commandment while holding on to rules created by humans and handed down to you.
Jesus continued,
Clearly, you are experts at rejecting God's commandment in order to establish these rules. Moses said,
Honor your father and your mother.
and,
The person who speaks against father or mother will certainly be put to death.
but you say, if you tell your father or mother, everything I'm expected to contribute to you is korban, that is, a gift I'm giving to God, then you are no longer required to care for your mother or father. In this way, you do away with God's word in favor of the rules handed down to you, which you pass on to others. And you do a lot of other things just like that.
Then Jesus called the crowd again and said,
Listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person.
After leaving the crowd, he entered a house where his disciples asked him about that riddle. He said to them,
Don't you understand either? Don't you know that nothing from the outside that enters a person has the power to contaminate? That's because it doesn't enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and it goes out into the sewer.
By saying this, Jesus declared that no food can contaminate a person in God's sight.
It's what comes out of a person that contaminates someone in God's sight.
he said,
It's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evil things come from the inside and contaminate a person in God's sight.
Jesus left that place and went into the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know that he had entered a house, but he couldn't hide.
In fact, a woman whose young daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard about him right away. She came and fell at his feet.
The woman was Greek, Syrophoenician by birth.
She begged Jesus to throw the demon out of her daughter.
He responded,
The children have to be fed first. It isn't right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs.
but she answered,
Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.
Good answer.
he said,
Go on home. The demon has already left your daughter.
When she returned to her house, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
After leaving the region of Tyre, Jesus went through Sidon toward the Galilee Sea, through the region of the 10 cities.
Some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly speak, and they begged him to place his hand on the man for healing. Jesus took him away from the crowd by himself and put his fingers in the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. Looking into heaven, Jesus sighed deeply and said,
Ephatha,
Which means,
open up.
At once, his ears opened, his twisted tongue was released, and he began to speak clearly.
Jesus gave the people strict orders not to tell anyone, but the more he tried to silence them, the more eagerly they shared the news. People were overcome with wonder, saying,
He does everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who can't speak.
In those days, there was another large crowd with nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples and told them,
I feel sorry for the crowd because they have been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they won't have enough strength to travel, for some have come a long distance.
His disciples responded.
How can anyone get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy these people?
Jesus asked.
How much bread do you have?
They said.
7 loaves?
He told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them apart, and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they gave the bread to the crowd. They also had a few fish. He said a blessing over them, then gave them to the disciples to hand out also. They ate until they were full.
They collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. This was a crowd of about 4,000 people.
Jesus sent them away, then got into a boat with his disciples and went over to the region of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees showed up and began to argue with Jesus.
To test him, they asked for a sign from heaven.
With an impatient sigh, Jesus said,
Why does this generation look for a sign? I assure you that no sign will be given to it.
Leaving them, he got back into the boat and crossed to the other side of the lake.
Jesus' disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, so they had only 1 loaf with them. In the boat, he gave them strict orders.
Watch out and be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees as well as the yeast of Herod.
The disciples discussed this among themselves.
He said this because we have no bread.
Jesus knew what they were discussing and said,
Why are you talking about the fact that you don't have any bread? Don't you grasp what has happened? Don't you understand? Are your hearts so resistant to what God is doing? Don't you have eyes? Why can't you see? Don't you have ears? Why can't you hear? Don't you remember? When I broke 5 loaves of bread for those 5,000 people, how many baskets full of leftovers did you gather?
They answered,
12.
And when I broke 7 loaves of bread for those 4,000 people, how many baskets full of leftovers did you gather?
They answered.
7.
Jesus said to them,
And you still don't understand.
Jesus and his disciples came to Bethsaida.
Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch and heal him.
Taking the blind man's hand, Jesus led him out of the village. After spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on the man, he asked him,
Do you see anything?
The man looked up and said,
I see people. They look like trees, only they're walking around.
Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again. He looked with his eyes wide open. His sight was restored, and he could see everything clearly.
Then Jesus sent him home, saying,
Don't go into the village.
Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples.
Who do people say that I am?
They told him.
Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets.
He asked them.
And what about you? What do you say that I am?
Peter answered.
You are the Christ.
Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him.
Then Jesus began to teach his disciples.
The human one must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the legal experts, and be killed, and then, after 3 days, rise from the dead.
He said this plainly, but Peter took hold of Jesus' hand and, scolding him, began to correct him. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples. then sternly corrected Peter.
Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts.
After calling the crowd together with his disciples, Jesus said to them,
All who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Why do people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the human one will be ashamed of that person when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels.
Jesus continued,
I assure you that some standing here won't die before they see God's kingdom arrive in power.
6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone.
He was transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they had been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus.
Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus,
Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.
He said this because he didn't know how to respond, for the 3 of them were terrified.
Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud.
This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him.
Listen to him.
Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until after the human one had risen from the dead.
So they kept it to themselves, wondering.
What's this rising from the dead?
They asked Jesus.
Why do the legal experts say that Elijah must come first?
He answered,
Elijah does come first to restore all things. Why was it written that the human one would suffer many things and be rejected? In fact, I tell you that Elijah has come, but they did to him whatever they wanted, just as it is written about him.
When Jesus, Peter, James, and John approached the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them and legal experts arguing with them.
Suddenly, the whole crowd caught sight of Jesus. They ran to greet him, overcome with excitement.
Jesus asked them.
What are you arguing about?
Someone from the crowd responded,
Teacher, I brought my son to you, since he has a spirit that doesn't allow him to speak. Wherever it overpowers him, it throws him into a fit. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and stiffens up. So I spoke to your disciples to see if they could throw it out, but they couldn't.
Jesus answered them.
Your faithless generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring him to me.
They brought him.
When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a fit.
He fell on the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth.
Jesus asked his father.
How long has this been going on?
He said,
Since he was a child, it has often thrown him into a fire, into water, trying to kill him. If you can do anything, help us. Show us compassion.
Jesus said to him,
If you can do anything, all things are possible for one who has faith.
At that, the boy's father cried out,
I have faith. Help my lack of faith.
Noticing that the crowd had surged together, Jesus spoke harshly to the unclean spirit.
Mute and deaf spirit, I command you to come out of him and never enter him again.
After screaming and shaking the boy horribly, the spirit came out. The boy seemed to be dead. In fact, several people said that he had died. But Jesus took his hand, lifted him up, and he arose.
After Jesus went into a house, his disciples asked him privately.
Why couldn't we throw the spirit out?
Jesus answered.
Throwing this kind of spirit out requires prayer.
From there, Jesus and his followers went through Galilee, but he didn't want anyone to know it. This was because he was teaching his disciples.
The human one will be delivered into human hands. They will kill him. 3 days after he is killed, he will rise up.
But they didn't understand this kind of talk.
And they
were afraid to ask him.